introduce myself at first. My name is Vincenzo Chianese. I come from Italy. I live in Czech Republic. And during the day, I work as a software developer into API, as a JavaScript developer mainly. But still, I consider myself as a strong .NET advocate. I like Spanish and Portuguese language. And I drink a lot of coffee. Let's have a look to the agenda, what I want to talk about today. So first of all, I will show you what is wrong on the classic API design, how can we do it better, and how API Blueprint can help. So before we start the journey, how many of you already know something about API Blueprint? Could you please raise your hand? Just my coworker and the guy over here. How many? Does anybody use API Blueprint for something? Neither my coworker does. Okay. What am I doing here? So by the way, how do people design and develop APIs today? So at the beginning, at a certain point of your project, a guy will show up and say you, hey, we need an API. And that guy could be you, could be your coworker, or could be your boss, or could be your customer. And the reasons to have an API are almost unlimited. For example, you may want to outsource your data and your processes to a third-party service that can make the same job in a more cost-effective way. Or, for example, there are products that are totally API-based, such as Parse or Kinayu, that are API-first. Or, more generally speaking, unless you're working with Transistor, when you create new software, you're using some other people's software. And the API are the way the customer can plug your software into their application. So that it is very, very important. So we need an API. The order is set. And then a group of guys will be formed, and they will close into a room with a whiteboard, and they will start agreeing on the things. How the API should look like, what features should it have, should it be in hypermedia, how about the versioning? And after drinking a lot of coffee and spending nights into the room, they will come up with a specification. And on top of that specification, they will start to drink Red Bull this time, and coding, writing the test, deploying the API, and they'll show it to the customer, which will say, yes, I don't really like what you have done. What is this? Why you're exposing table names? What is this foreign key? I just want to list something. And why this happened? The thing is that API providers and API consumers often are not on the same page. Very often, API providers are solving the problem of the customer in a different way, in a totally different way. Why did we end up in this situation? Because what we have done here is basically we design the API, we implement the API with the test and deploying, and then we give it to the customer, which will give you the feedback. I like this, I don't like this, but from the design to collecting the feedback, you will wait weeks or months. And then incorporating and responding to the feedback will require other weeks and months because you have to modify the design, modify the implementation and the test, and give it back to the customer again. And we already have a word for this development process because 14 years ago, beyond the rise of musical group like Led Zeppelin, Blue Effect, or AC/DC or ABBA that personally I really like, the waterfall model was coined, and most of us agree that the waterfall model could be a failing one for some kind of software development. For some kind of software development. And I'm here today I want to rewrite your brain and convince you that waterfall model is failing for API designers as well. So let's try to recap what is an API. Of course, everybody knows what is the API acronym. It means Application Program Interface. But that may not tell you very much, actually. An API is an interface, of course, and that means that an API is this line. But we have to figure out who is on the left and on the right side. On the left side, there is your data. And keep in mind, when I say data, I mean your application model data, your semantic data, not its persistence or representation. And this is something that people tend to forget. What is on the other side, in your opinion? Anybody has got an idea?
The user.
Say again? Exactly. There is the human. But very often people try to see a computer on the other side. And while this is ultimately true, because at the end of the day, a computer is going to use the API, perform the request, and do the subsequent operation, the API are used to write new software. And then the API experience should be focused on who writes the software, not what or who is going to execute it. And of course, human is too generic. So let me introduce for you our Clientina Vivoyarkova. And she's a front-end developer. She writes mobile application. She eats chocolate. And she likes to think in terms of JavaScript, CoffeeScript, Swift, Android, Objective-C. And of course, she, as a client developer, has totally different concerns than us. Because when I write API, I am concerned about my security, maintenance, caching, uptime, versioning, and so on. And this is how it should be. But on the same way, Clientina is not, she doesn't really care about this thing because she has got different concerns. She wants to know, how do I debug your API? How can I plug it in my Angular application? Is it easy to use? Where can I find the tutorials? And also, there are different cultures between Clientina and our backend developer. Because people usually try to stick around a particular programming language. And everybody knows that writing an API in JavaScript is different than writing an API in .NET or in Python. And it's not just about naming convention. It's about practice. Writing idiomatic JavaScript is different than writing idiomatic Python. And often, the API implementation reflects the programming language that has been used for. And this makes the experience for Clientina a pain. And furthermore, the empathy is hard. Of course, you can't find a book called Write the Perfect API. You can find blog posts about 10 things to not forget about writing API for your customer. Because each API is different, and each customer has different requirements. So the best way to get in empathy with your customer often is ask to your customer. But how can we involve our customer into our development process? Well, the answer to the failing waterfall model is prototype and iteration. So the idea will be we design an API, and we implement a prototype that can we give to the customer. And it will say you, I like this, I don't like this. And then you can go back to the design process again, modify the thing, modify the implementation in 2 or 3 days, and give it back to the customer. And you continue to iterate until you get something that is usable for both sides. Then you implement it for real, and you give it to your customer. And this time, he will be happy, because at first, he was part of your process. And the second thing is that probably he will be already able to use your API. So first lesson, we have to change the development process for the API. The waterfall model doesn't work. Of course, but let's freeze this concept. And we are here, full stack, JavaScript, web. So another question is, OK, so how does the ideal web API look like? If you try to search for this sentence on Google, you will find something like, use HTTP verbs. You have to craft your URLs, use JSON, provide filtering, and support the versioning. But is this what really makes an API great? I don't really think so. Because I'm quite sure that if you ask to your customer, how do you want your web API, he will surely answer something like, I want it easy to use. I want it consistent, compatible with the past, perfectly documented, easy to learn, and exposes enough to satisfy my use case. And notice how there is no technical sentence over here. In my opinion, the API design is divided into 3 parts: protocol, architecture, and developer experience. So the protocol. The protocol is a craft. It's easy, because it's written into the specs. And it's something that a good framework could do that for you. While on the other side, developer experience and architecture cannot be automated. You need a human. You need to understand the needs of your customer. You need experience, and you need to think about it. And the worst thing is that today I can still see people claiming to be API architect just focusing on the protocol. And it's such a waste to put most of your efforts in something that can be totally automated. Because focusing on the protocol is just like, suppose you want to build a house, you call your architect, hey, I want to build a house. And she will start to say, we will use this kind of cement, we will use this kind of bricks and this new technique construction, which is great. But if you don't know in advance where do you want to put the bathroom, where do you want to put the kitchen and the bedroom, no matter what kind of technique or material are you going to use, the result is going to be terrible. About the developer experience, in order to be pragmatic, just remember that on the other side there is a human and you're mostly done. When I say treat as a human, I mean at first errors. Learn how to do properly errors. Because when people is using your API to build new software, they are basically debugging. And if something is going wrong, they want to know what the hell is going on with the API. And sending out messages like error, or cannot insert, or generic failure won't help at all. So no matter how you do the error, but for example, this is a very nice specification of JSON-based error format that will provide message, a description, and helpful link, but provide human-readable errors. And then documentation. Write documentation and make sure it's up to date, because an out-of-date documentation is just a little bit better than not having a documentation. For example, Restify. The documentation of Restify is totally outdated. And we had a use case where we had to dig into the source code to understand what was going on. And on the end, we changed the product. Bye-bye, Restify. And provide a big picture, not just a reference. Having a documentation that is just a reference is like having a dictionary. Nobody opens a dictionary for fun. It is used when I want to know something in particular. Providing a big picture, I mean, if you're going, for example, to craft a system that can help you to order coffee, write what is your concept of coffee, write what is your concept of order, and how do I do that? Provide tutorials, provide examples. And on the end, consistency. Your API should be opinionated. Make decisions and then stick to them, no matter if you want to use camel case or underscore to separate the word. It doesn't matter if you want to use traditional English or simplified English. Make a decision and stick to them. As a small commercial break, API can help you with this. Dread is a tool that can, every time you push something into your system, it can check if the documentation is up to date with the implementation. And also API can help you to write great documentation and ensure consistency into your product. Now, furthermore, while designing an API, you have to model your domain logic and not the representation. What I want to say here is that, for example, if you're, again, building your coffee order system, your central entity is the coffee. And even if your coffee entity is divided into 20 tables, on the API level, the coffee is one entity. So I should be able to fetch it in one request, to create a new one in one request. So you have to hide your complexity about your coffee split into so many tables in one entity. And also, the same goes with the operation. If in your internal implementation, in order to create a coffee, you have to make 20 internal requests and spam 100 processes, me as a client developer, I don't care. I want to make it in one operation. And remember that. Then choose a suitable format, but don't think too much about it because it is an implementation detail. Explain your semantic, how do I order something, what can I do with the entity, and then you can build the API. And again, API Blueprint can help with you to model your domain logic, to explain your semantic, and to build API clients for free. Now, given that, let's go back to this question. how can I get involved my customer into my design process? How do we do that? Of course, there are many, many ways, but we in API believe that the best way is using the API blueprint. An API blueprint is basically a text file that looks like this, but I don't focus on the details because I would lose your attention. But the most important thing is that the main difference with Swagger or Ramol or the other API description language is that at first, it is a markdown file. So if you ever used GitHub or Stack Overflow, you should already know what markdown file is. And the best thing is that it's human readable. It means that at first, I can give you to my non-tech people. They can read and understand what is written there. I can give you to my tech writer and can write great documentation on top of it. And since it's a text file, I can plug it into my source control system. It's versionable, and I can comment on the rows, and we can work together on it. And you can also parse an API blueprint. We have an open source parser that from the API blueprint can generate an abstract syntax tree, and you can do a lot of crazy stuff with that. For example, you can generate a documentation. That's what we do in API. And thanks to that, you can then generate a console to test out the API. You can generate code examples for the API. And I think the code examples are really, really important. Because if you're struggling in using the API, and on the other side, when you click on the console and it works, I want to know, okay, how did you make this call? And we can show you the code we use it. And that should help you to debug. And also, recently we have shipped Amazon that is a way to describe very complex data structure in a markdown way. And starting from that, we can generate your JSON payload, your JSON schema, your XML payload, or the format that you want. And once the API blueprint is parsed, we can generate a mock server. It's a static mock server that behaves exactly in the way you describe it in your API blueprint. And you can give the mock server to your front-end developer or to your customer that can start to develop their application on an API that doesn't even exist yet, because you're still working on its real implementation. With the parsed API blueprint, you can use a debugging proxy server. That is something that is in the middle for the client to the live production server, so that if something is going wrong, you can see the diff between your call and the expected one. You are missing this header. This field is not compliant with what I told you. And also, you can plug it into your continuous integration system with Dread. And every time you push something, Dread will test if your documentation is up to date with the implementation. And if something is going wrong, the test will fail. But the documentation will always be in sync with the live production server. And also, as I said before, given that it's a text file, you can branch, you can make some change, you can collaborate, you can issue a pull request, and then you can publish a new version. And most of these things are now getting integrated into API itself. And as I said before, you can inspect the AST tree and check for style guides or business rules. For example, hey, you have to use traditional English, simplified English. Or, hey, every error message should have this kind of JSON payload. And you can check this thing on top of the AST. And to recap the thing, basically, with the API blueprint serves as a contract for front-end developer and the back-end part. The front-end developers can start building the application today with something that does not exist and can iterate on that. And on the other side, the backend guys can work on the API implementation and testing push after push and see if they are working in the way we agreed with the front-end developer. And everybody should at least be happy, or a little bit more happy. So this is what I mean for API design lifecycle. You design the API. You prototype the API multiple times, infinite times, until you get something that is usable for both sides. And only then you start implementing it with the tools that I showed before. And as said before, API Blueprint is open source, it's language agnostic. It's a work for API, but we have so many tools that let you spin a mock-up server without us. You can style check the things without us. You can parse without us. We have also plugins for Sublime and the most common editors. So really, it's not vendor locked in. And also, I'm really proud to say that we have got really big customers that are using us, and they are very happy with us. So at least I will give it a try. It may not be your solution, but my general advice is that no matter if you want to use API Blueprint or Swagger or whatever, but think about your API and choose an API description language. And as a last thing, I just want to talk publicly. Honza Javorec, that is the guy that made these very, very amazing cartoons. And this is the API Blueprint website. You can find this us, and this is our website. So check it out if you are interested. And that's all I have for you. So thank you very much for attending, and enjoy the rest of the presentation. So the question is, just for the guys over there, he's working on a client-side application, and in order to retrieve some data, he's forced to make 3 HTTP calls, and the question is, how do I convince my backend guy to provide all the data I need in one call? Is that what you were asking for? So, is the backend guy working with you?
Yeah.
In the same company?
Yes.
Then it's a problem. Because if not, you'll just fire him. But that's a really hard thing. Because migrating from the legacy is not easy at all. And the only advice that I can give you is at first try to raise the awareness of the problem and how do you struggle a lot making 3 requests in order to make it, and show how, for example, using perhaps agreeing on the thing on the next project could be definitely helpful. You should try to convince them that bringing you into the API design will be beneficial for both. That's the only thing that I can say you about that. Or pay him. That may work. Any other question? Yeah. API, and you are both the front-end guy and the back-end guy. Yeah. So what is the rest of the question?
So how would you go about designing that if you haven't got this kind of someone to go to and ask?
Oh, I got it.
Designing it in theory.
Yeah, of course, auto-reviewing isn't very helpful. And perhaps if you're making a totally self-project, perhaps it doesn't really make sense to have such well-described API, because you're going to consume your own stuff. So perhaps these will be a useless overhead. The API Blueprint, and generally speaking, the API you're using to communicate with someone else, with another team. For example, let's say Facebook, no? Facebook is not using any API description language, is not using any REST principle. Why? Because he's consuming his own stuff. So he doesn't design API. He uses Falcor from Netflix. He uses Relay so that he can query the data directly from the server. That means I have the complete control over my system. I don't need an API. So perhaps, in your case, you don't really need an API, or you don't need to have it in a such documented way, perhaps. But it may vary from the case. Any other?
Enjoy.
And I guess you're here because you want to know something about API in this